My name is Dr. Malcolm Dick. I'm Director of the Centre for West Midlands History at the University of Birmingham. This talk is an attempt to draw attention to a number of ways in which both observers of Birmingham and the Black Country and also artists of various kinds portrayed the Black Country and Birmingham in order to make sense of what we would now call pollution, whether we're talking about aerial pollution or talking about pollution on the landscape, on the environment itself. If we can cast our minds back to the distant days of 2012, many of you may well remember the opening of the Olympic Games, which was remarkably, partially a celebration of Britain as an industrial power. And I was watching the opening ceremony, and rising through the landscape were smoking chimneys, which represented the impact of industrialization, and also the steam engines that were used to power industry or to pump water out of mines, and which it might be argued contributed to the pollution that industrialization caused. We are, of course, heirs to the Industrial Revolution, and our concern with environmental degradation, climate change, and so on reflects what has happened over several hundred years. I want to begin really by exploring four images, two of Birmingham and two of the Black Country. The first of Birmingham is a very famous print by William Wesley of the East Prospect of Birmingham in 1732, a dramatic portrait of Birmingham in black and white, which shows Birmingham as a hill town with St. Philip's Church, now the cathedral, on top of the hill, and then descending down the hill towards Digbeth and Derrit End, a built-up town with churches and other public buildings. We can see in the foreground the River Wray, which was never used for industrial transportation, but was very important as a source of water for the industrial activities that existed along the borders of the River Wray in Digbeth and Derrit End. The image, though, doesn't really convey an image of an industrial town. It conveys an image of a rather attractive provincial town with decent public buildings set in a rural landscape. The print was designed to be purchased and which people could then put up in their homes. It was an indication, I think, of how people could have a pride in Birmingham as it was growing rapidly and developing in prosperity. But we don't see a polluted town per se, despite the presence of industry. The second image is entitled Birmingham in 1886. This is a very, very different image. It is a bird's eye view of the centre of Birmingham. It identifies some of the recently created public buildings, the oldest being the Town Hall, which is of course still there, the recently built Council House, Mason College, which was an ancestor of the University of Birmingham, the Reference Library, and also the School of Art. Some of those buildings are no longer in existence, like the Reference Library and Mason College, but a number of them are still there, so it's a recognisable image. But what the image above all portrays is outside of this civic area. There's a vast sea of industrial activity, largely revealed by the presence of factory chimneys and smoke. And I think the message that is being conveyed there is that the industrial growth of Birmingham is responsible for the wealth of the city, but it's led to pollution, it's led to areas of Birmingham that are less salubrious than others. But on top of that, we have a developing city council, a civic environment which can bring, if you like, civilization and order to a random process of industrialization. So these are two images of Birmingham that convey different messages. The next two images relate to the Black Country. The first is a view of Dudley in 1777, a perspective of Dudley produced by Thomas Saunders. This is part of a collection of market towns in the county of Worcester. Dudley was already by 1777 one of the most industrialized towns in the county, if not in the country. It was still relatively small, but it was growing rapidly. It was a centre of a coal mining district. There was a lot of iron making, and there were other industrial activities at work. If we look at the print, we don't get much of a sense of industrialization. There is, though, close to the middle of the print, a glass cone which is pumping out smoke. But otherwise, Dudley is situated in a rural environment, and we can see Dudley Castle clearly visible on top of the hill. Again, we can portray this image as something that was produced for people to put up in their homes, maybe as an indication of pride in their place where they lived or their place of origin. We can see industry, but we don't see much. We don't get a sense of the smoke to any great extent. We don't see the flames. We don't see the dirt. We don't see the industrial workers. In very many ways, we could see it as an anodyne portrait of Dudley. The second image of the Black Country is an image that was printed in the Illustrated London News in December 1866. This is not so much of Dudley, but of a place in the north of the Black Country, on the outskirts of Wolverhampton. But this portrays an image of the Black Country that was very common in people's perception of the area throughout the late 19th century and indeed into the 20th century. What it shows is an image of desolation. The foreground contains wasteland of worn-out industrial machinery, coal mines that are no longer working. But in the middle distance, there's a sea of factory chimneys and smoke, and the whole print is shrouded in tones of grey, which gives an impression of an area that you don't want to go to. This is how the Black Country was widely portrayed in the late 19th century, and I can use as a kind of stepping point for some of the other things I'm going to refer to. So there are two sets of contrasts there. But how would these developments come about? The Black Country and Birmingham were really fortuitously situated for industrial development for a number of reasons. One was relatively easy transport links. But particularly importantly, the Black Country was basically a landscape which we now associate with the four metropolitan boroughs of Wolverhampton, Sandwell, Walsall and Dudley, but which traditionally was linked with the site of the South Staffordshire and North Worcestershire coalfields, which provided vast quantities of coal that in most cases could be easily exploited. Coal could often not be used directly in industrial processes, but could be transformed into coke as a result of the partial burning out of the impurities, a process that was developed by Abraham Darby I in nearby Coalbrookdale. The area also had a range of other resources. There was plenty of iron ore. There was limestone that could be used as a flux in blast furnaces and for other purposes. And there were vast supplies of clay that could be used for brick making and building. The Black Country and Birmingham were really symbiotic areas. Often they're contrasted as being very different, but one could not have really existed without the other. Birmingham tended to be the main area where goods were turned into finished products, whereas the Black Country supplied the raw materials, and the rapid development of canals at the end of the 18th century, then railways in the 19th century, provided a means of transportation of goods between the two areas and a way of transporting finished manufacturing products elsewhere. These areas were observed by people who left records. I want to focus upon three observers in the 18th and 19th century who commented upon what we might call pollution. And these three observers are firstly Anna Seward, a poet, James Naismith, a Scottish-based industrialist and inventor, and Samuel Sidney, who came from Birmingham but made his reputation as a writer. Anna Seward was born in Derbyshire, but she lived in Lichfield for most of her adult life, where her father was a senior clergyman at the cathedral. She was quite well off, and she travelled widely. She wrote poetry. Many of her letters still survive, so we can reconstruct her attitudes, her experiences, and her relationships. Seward is important in this context because she was the first person to use the word pollution in the way in which we use it now, referring to the contamination of the air and environment, as opposed to the traditional usage of the term, which was meant to refer to the sexual violation of women by men. She applies the term pollution to the landscape. She was somebody who was very interested in the works of John Milton. And her most famous poem in this context, the poem Coalbrookdale of 1785, was a reworking of Milton's Comus for the West Midlands region in the late 18th century. In that poem, Seward ranges widely over towns and districts of the West Midlands and asserts how damaging the impact of industry was. As a sufferer from asthma, she was particularly sensitive to smoke and fumes. So though what she saw was part of what she wrote about, what she experienced medically was also an important dimension.
While red the countless fires, with umbered flames, bicker on all thy hills, darkening the summer's sun with columns large of thick, sulphureous smoke which spread like palls that screen the dead upon the sylvan robe of thy aspiring rocks, pollute thy gales and stain thy glassy waters.
I use that extract, which she applies to Coalbrookdale and the River Severn, because it's there that she uses the term pollute, which becomes a theme which she returns to during the course of what is quite a long poem. But I want to concentrate really on what she says about a couple of other areas. Firstly, Birmingham, and she wrote,
Expanding Birmingham, illumined by intellect, as gay in wealth, commands her eye-accumulating walls from month to climb the adjacent hills, creep on the circling plains, now here, now there, divergent, change the hedges, thickets, trees, upturned, disrooted into mortared piles, the street elongate, and the statelier square.
Most observers of Birmingham would talk about how wonderful the growth of the city was as a reflection of its prosperity. However, she expresses disquiet about how the adjacent landscape is being uprooted. There's another quotation of hers that I want to refer to. That is where she talks about the impact of chemicals upon the landscape. We don't know exactly what part of the West Midlands this refers to. Almost certainly, though, it refers to James Keir's chemical factory in Tipton.
So, with intent transmutant, chemists bruise the shrinking leaves and flowers, whose steams, saline, congealing swift on the recipient's sides, shoot into crystals. And the night frost, thus, insidious creeping on the watery plain, wave after wave encrusts, till liquid change to solid.
Anna Seward was a particularly sensitive and early observer of the negative impact of industrialisation. It's really not until well into the 19th century that we get within a wider popular consciousness an understanding that industrialisation, as well as something that could provide work, wealth, and goods, could also have damaging consequences. My second observer is James Naismith. Naismith was born in Edinburgh. His father was an artist, but he was best known as an inventor and successful industrialist and writer. As a young man, Naismith went on a walking tour of Britain. One aspect of that tour was his journey to the Black Country, and there he wrote extensively about his experiences of the area in his autobiography.
I proceeded at once to Dudley. The Black Country is anything but picturesque. The earth seems to have been turned inside out. Its entrails are strewn about. Nearly the entire surface of the ground is covered with cinder heaps and mounds of scoriae. The coal which has been drawn from below ground is blazing on the surface. The district is crowded with iron furnaces, puddling furnaces, and coal pit engine furnaces. By day and by night, the country is glowing with fire, and the smoke of the ironworks hovers over it. There is a rumbling and a clanking of iron forges and rolling mills. Workmen, covered with smut and with fierce white eyes, are seen moving about amongst the glowing iron and the dull thud of forge hammers. Amidst these flaming, smoky, clanging works, I beheld the remains of what had once been happy farmhouses, now ruined and deserted. The ground underneath them had sunk by the working out of the coal, and they were falling to pieces. They had in former times been surrounded by clumps of trees, but only the skeletons of them remained, dead, black and leafless. The grass had been parched and killed by the vapours of sulphurous acid thrown out by the chimneys, and every herbaceous object was of a ghastly grey, the emblem of vegetable death in its saddest aspect. In some places I heard a sort of chirruping sound, as of some forlorn bird haunting the ruins of the old farmsteads. But no, the chirrup was a vile delusion. It proceeded from the shrill creaking of the coal-winding chains, which were placed in small tunnels beneath the hedgeless road.
Naismith is clearly deeply shocked by what he saw, and it's a very visual portrayal. But there's more that he goes on to say, where he talks about the wider impact and significance of industry, which had been responsible at one level for prosperity, but was responsible for creating a price on landscape and on human experience. He arrived at Dudley Castle, and sitting on the top of the hill on which Dudley Castle is situated, he wrote,
Melancholy grandeur is rendered all the more impressive by the coal and ironworks with which it is surrounded. The venerable trees struggle for existence under the destroying influence of sulphuric acid, while the grass is withered and the vegetation everywhere blighted. I sat down on an elevated part of the ruins and looked down upon the extensive district, with its roaring and blazing furnaces, the smoke of which blackened the country as far as the eye could reach. And as I watched the decaying trees, I thought of the price we had to pay for our vaunted supremacy in the manufacture of iron.
A third observer, a later figure than Naismith, Samuel Sidney, was well known as a popular journalist and writer. He wrote a number of books. One of his most famous was Rides on Railways of 1851, which was meant as a guide to those members of the middle classes who travelled widely by railway and could get a sense of what they could see through the windows of their carriages. Sidney described the Black Country.
The pleasant green of pastures is almost unknown. The streams, in which no fishes swim, are black and unwholesome. The natural dead flat is often broken by huge hills of cinders and spoil from the mines. The few trees are stunted and blasted. No birds are to be seen, except for a few smoky sparrows, and for miles on miles a black waste spreads around, where furnaces continually smoke, steam engines thud and hiss, and long chains clank, while blind gin horses walk their doleful round. From time to time you pass a cluster of deserted roofless cottages of dingiest brick, half swallowed up in sinking pits, or inclining to every point of the compass, while the timbers point up like ribs of a half-decayed corpse. The majority of the natives of this Tartarian region are in full keeping with the scenery. Savages, coarsely clad in filthy garments, with no change on weekdays and Sundays, they converse in a language belarded with filthy and disgusting oaths, which can scarcely be recognised as the same as that of civilised England.
Sidney not only extensively attacked the landscape as a horrific scene from hell, but also produced a sustained attack on the inhabitants of the Black Country, attacking their appearance and also their language, which was totally not understandable by those outside. He saw them as a subhuman race, as savages, not as proper civilized English people. That's interesting because it's an early example, not the only example, of how the inhabitants of the Black Country are seen as absorbing the desolation and degradation of their environment. The important point is that from the late 18th century onwards, various observers were conscious of the negative impact of industrialization upon both the landscape and the atmosphere. But also, interestingly, and we should not ignore this, often polluted areas were linked with polluted inhabitants, and the people who lived in the area were dismissed as subhuman inhabitants of a region that had no redeeming features. I'm going to finish by taking a number of images. I want to begin with a printmaker, Richard Shattuck. He was born in Solihull, very famous engraver at the end of the 19th century. One of his most important collection of images is called Etchings Illustrative of Scenes in the Coal and Iron District of South Staffordshire in 1878. These images are superbly executed as prints, but from our perspective, they also show how he perceived the impact of industry and how he perceived through that the impact of pollution and degradation upon the landscape. Two in particular are very interesting from the perspective of the impact of industrialization. One is called the New Buffery, which is a working blast furnace or foundry in the Black Country, where you have chimneys spouting out smoke, but around that there's a devastated landscape of dereliction. The second image, called Blast Furnaces Cradley, is represented almost entirely in shades of black and dark grey. This is a larger industrial scene. This shows smoke coming out of chimneys and also flames from the blast furnaces themselves. You get a sense there of the power of industry, which Naismith alluded to, but also how devastating it was on the landscape. Those are simply two of many images that he produced, which are a record, but also a poetic collection of prints of the region. There are a number of more conventional prints. One, for example, of Birmingham from the south in 1870, looking towards the city itself. Birmingham is shrouded in smoke. You can see factory chimneys, and you can see that from the observer it's not a particularly pleasant place in which to live, but it's not quite as damaging a portrayal as many of the portrayals of the Black Country. Another artist who represented the Black Country was Edwin Butler Bayliss. He covered the transition from the 19th century to the 20th century. Like Shattuck, he produced images of industrial premises, but in this case paintings rather than prints. Again, the colours that he uses are very muted ones, black, brown, grey, to represent industrial premises and smoke, and also the sort of flames that emerged from the industrial activities. Other pictures of his show individuals as part of the landscape. They are revealed as trudging to work. They are not given a personality. We can't see their faces. We usually see their rear views. Bent over, moving over desolated landscape towards what we assume is their place of occupation. Like Shattuck, Butler Bayliss's images are very poetic, extremely atmospheric, but give the representation of a scene that is not an attractive one, not a pleasant one to live in, and not a pleasant one to work in. Interestingly, Butler Bayliss's family were an industrial family in the Black Country. There are other images that we can reveal. One is a very famous photograph from about 1900, the Pit Bank Women of Wednesbury. This is a collection of women outside of a coal mine. These are individuals who would pick coal out of the slag heaps. This photograph shows women who are badly clothed. They look as if they've suffered throughout their lives. But in many ways, it's an exploitative picture because it was turned into a postcard, and clearly people could send it as a representation of an area that they'd visited. One of the main ways in which the Black Country, we can say, has been represented in modern culture is through J.R.R. Tolkien. Tolkien, as a boy, lived in Birmingham, and it's often alleged that his portrayal of the devastated landscape of Mordor is indicative of how he saw the Black Country when he visited there. In summary, we can say representations of Birmingham and the Black Country through visual means and also through writings were frequently negative. We live with the consequences of that in the way in which these areas are still seen today by people from outside, particularly the Black Country.